the Center for Italian Culture at Fitchburg State College, the Sogni d'Oro project. It's Tuesday, September 4th, 9:45 a.m. Our first interviewee is Joe Addante at his home at 535 South Street, number 22-2. Thanks, Joe, for taking time again to talk with me. I was hoping that you could give me some biographical information, specifically when you were born, what your birth name is. I was wondering, is it Joseph or is it Giuseppe?
I was born on the 25th of August in 1926 at 2 a.m. in the morning by my father's little log that I found. They named me Joseph Bartholomew Addante. Bartholomew because the 24th of August is the big feast day in my father's village. There's a church that was built in 1100 or 1200, and it's a historical site in that area. And that's how I got the name. Joseph from my father and Bartholomew from the feast day.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Fitchburg. I was the fourth child that my parents had. They had one in Italy that my father never saw again, that died when he was 3 or 4 years old. My mother and father were separated for 10 years because of World War I. My mother rejoined my father in 1920 in Fitchburg, and in 1922 my sister Mary was born. 23 my sister Rose was born, and 3 years later a son was born, which was a source of joy to my dad. And we grew up together. Also living with us were my two uncles for a number of years because they had come also from Italy. And I jokingly say that I grew up with 3 fathers, my Uncle Rocco and my Uncle Dominic. Rocco also has a son, Rocco Jr., and Uncle Dominic remained a bachelor and was never married. From there we lived on the Water Street Lane, which was part of what was called a patch in those days. I attended St. Bernard Grammar School, which was a Catholic parochial school for St. Bernard Parish. However, since my father's brother was a Franciscan priest, he was anxious for us to have a Roman Catholic education, and being acquainted with Monsignor Donnelly, who was pastor of St. Bernard at the time, we were given the privilege of attending the quote-quote Irish parochial school. I graduated grammar school there and then attended St. Bernard, which then became the Central Catholic High School, graduating in 1944.
Okay.
Break.
I was hoping that you could go back a little bit. And last week when I was here,
Yes.
you mentioned something about your mom and dad. Your father had to wait nearly 10 years to bring your mother over. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes. Well, when my mother
little...
arrived, of course the family started, and as I said, my sisters were born, and so was I. My recollection of my early childhood goes back to about 1931 or 30. When I was probably 5 or 6 years old, my recollection is going to Americanization classes with my mother. These were held at what was the Registry of Motor Vehicles building, and the upstairs was sort of a classroom hall kind of arrangement where classes were given in English for immigrants and also Americanization, which in today's terminology would be called instructions for assimilation. Very interesting because the woman that taught this was Margaret Kelty. And Margaret Kelty was a legend in her own time, probably one of the foremost people in adult education in the United States by the time she died. I remember fondly her talking about the 500 basic English words, which I wonder why they can't be used today, done by some professor from England that came over here, and she adopted that technique. And with the use of these 500 words, apparently one could communicate and get along. But above and beyond that, Margaret was a genuinely helpful person. She was the daughter of a pharmacist who had a drugstore in that area, and at his time had learned to speak Italian to better serve his Italian-American clientele. Margaret has sort of been a legend in the memory of most of us in that particular period of history. She and her sister were always a helpful part of the community, and probably helped bridge the differences between the Italian community, if you will, and the Irish community at a time when some saw the Italian movement as a quote Latin invasion. Also at that time there were other people who were quite helpful to the Italian community. There was a Miss Courtney and her sister. They were school teachers, and of course in those days they were unmarried. And also there was a Mary Botley who was the principal of the Nolan School. These people all had a meaningful role, and a large role, in helping the Italo-Americans or the newly arrived Italian immigrants to get adjusted to the American way of life, learning the language and the expressions, and also sort of acting as a bridge in many cases between they and their Irish neighbors.
So how old were you when you remember going to these Americanization classes?
Probably between 5 years old, 6 years old, just prior to the first grade, and then also sometimes even after the first grade, because some of them were conducted in the evening.
Was that your introduction to English, or did you hear it from friends?
We grew up speaking both languages without actually recognizing that there was a difference. We spoke Italian at home, spoke English with our friends, without even giving it a thought, frankly. Some of our friends who were attending the Immaculate Conception School had to learn French because the classes were conducted in French in those days. And some of them grew up speaking English, Italian from home, and French from school, right, which became an advantage to them.
But prior to school, you were probably living in an Italian neighborhood where there was
English spoken. My father, bear in mind, my father had been here 10 years before my mother had arrived. He had already become, I believe, a citizen. And he ran a checkbook, ran a business, and spoke English in a very passable way. So that he did speak quite a bit of English at home in addition to Italian, hopefully encouraging my mother in her English, which she picked up fairly readily and read almost all the novels of those days, the classics. I remember her reading to me from Les Miserables in English, which I had forgotten until I saw the play in London, and it all came back to me. Yeah. So, no, and my father was a very, and mother both, were very literate people, and they loved, they had read many of the classics in Italian, and they were sort of rediscovering them in English.
So tell me more. I tried to ask you this just a few minutes ago, but your father, how he tried to get your mother to America, and he had some sort of resistance, or
no, he had no problem. No, that was his mother. My father had no problem in those days getting his wife over here. But at the end of World War II, my father had a love for bringing back his mother to this country because he and both my uncles could have cared for her very easily. But in going through the immigration papers, it became complicated and it dragged out, and my grandmother died in Italy without ever having seen her son again, and I never got to know her. And my father lost interest and decided never to return to Italy. And it was a sad thing because I had kind of hoped to go with him. In fact, the first thing I did, a meaningful thing after his death, was to go to Italy. I wanted to find out where his sister was and my uncles and the village and the home the house where he was born. And I have visited several times since. And I managed to bring my Franciscan uncle to this country for 2 visits. And so I began to bridge the communication between the cousins and the uncles and the aunts and that sort of thing.
Okay. So did Dominic or Rocco ever go back to Italy?
Yes, my uncle Rocco went back he went back in 1937, was married, and he had the same sad experience that my father had. He was separated from his wife for 10 years until the end of World War II. When she came here, then his son was born, Rocco. My uncle Dominic managed to go back a couple of times because he wanted to visit his sister who was alive then and his brother, which he did, and then that was his last visit.
Okay, now your father, how many siblings did he have? He had the 3 brothers?
My father was from a family of 10 children. I think there were 7 survivors. There's my father and his sister and 3 brothers that I knew, and another sister that I never knew, but I met her children, and another sister that I never knew that survived to adulthood, if you will, you know.
And their names?
Oh.
Do you remember their?
My father's name was Joseph. His sister's name was Agatha, who was an extremely lucky woman in the very early days, survived a double mastectomy and lived to be 85 or 86 years of age.
Wow, in the old country.
In the old country.
Wow.
So it was done back in the days when surgery was primitive by today's standards. And then there was my uncle Rocco was next, and I think there were a couple of sisters in between. One was Anina. So to go down the list, it was my father, Agatha, I think Anina, Rocco, and then there was another sister whose name I don't remember, and then my uncle Dominic, and then my uncle Francesco, who became the Franciscan, that I recall in the names, and then a couple others.
So I read somewhere that, in the old days that a lot of marriages were arranged, but your father wished to choose his own wife?
My father was a very independent person, and he chose his own wife in a very romantic way and courted her with poetry. My father had a poetic flair, and I think he passed it on to his children because we all love poetry. But the one problem was that they were of opposite political parties in their families. And my father's main reason for leaving Italy was not so much the opportunity, because he was a craftsman. He made handmade shoes, and there was always a lot of work for him. So rather than stay home and get involved in squabbles, he left. He wrote to a friend of his who was in Maine, and the friend never answered him. He just sent him a ticket. I think it was a $35 steerage ticket in those days. And my dad arrived in this country in 1910 and never went back. He landed in Boston, not Ellis Island. And then from there he went to Connecticut, and he got work with the railroad, because there were some Italian men that would take care of him as far as the language was concerned while he was trying to learn English. And he stayed there for about 3 months. And they had an Italian daily newspaper in those days, published in Italian for the immigrants. And there were many newspapers, just like the Finnish Rabbia Press here. And there was an ad in the paper by a shoemaker in Fitchburg by the name of Cicino, who was looking for a shoemaker. So my dad came to Fitchburg, and he was here till he died. He worked for about 4 months with this man, and because he could not arrange to have his evenings off to go to night school to learn English, he quit the job because his primary interest was in learning English. And he got another job working at one of the mills. I think the Bulli Mill was the name of it. And he worked there for a short period of time, finally saved enough to get a little shop started. And by 1912, he was able to send for his brother to help him in the business. And by 1915, he had bought a building of his own. Tried to send for my mother. World War I broke out, and that became an impossibility until the 1920s, when my mother and my other uncle, Dominic, came together from Italy.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about the political party? Can you tell me more about that? He didn't want to become involved in any squabbles in Italy, and that is why.
Yeah, my father was not much of a political animal. He saw politics for what it was in many ways, mm-hmm. not a very, in his mind, a very constructive thing anyway. Mm-hmm. More than that, I never heard. I guess he did like my uncle. My mother's brother was a very political person, mm-hmm. and very active. And I think if there was any antagonism, it was between my mother's brother and my father's family, if you will, being opposing political persuasions. Whether it was conservative or liberal in those days, I don't know. I never really got a handle on it. My uncle Luigi, my mother's brother, was mayor of 3 villages at the same time, because you had to be a property owner in order to run for political office, and you had to be a property owner before you could vote. It was a democracy, but it was a selective democracy in those days. And but he was very active, and then his wife had died with only one surviving child after having gone through many pregnancies. So it was he and his daughter, who actually grew up with my mother as a sister, although she was a niece, because my uncle was the oldest and my mother was the youngest, mm-hmm. of a large family, but they were the only 2 survivors. In those days, that was not uncommon. Mm-hmm. And Giovannina, who was my mother's cousin, was almost like her sister, and they grew up together, and they used to communicate a lot. But then my mother joined my dad here in 1920. But the political thing was not something that my father was interested in, and he just got away from it. And I think it was the best thing that he did, because he thoroughly enjoyed this country. Mm-hmm.
About his wife or your mother was from the same small village?
Oh yes, they were practically across the street neighbors.
Okay.
I mean, the village today has only a population of about 1,000. Mm-hmm. And in those days it was probably a little bigger because they had larger families. And it was mainly an agricultural village to begin with. It is now still slightly agricultural, but more on a hobby basis. And it has become the weekend place for those that grew up in the village that have sought work in the cities nearby. And they go back there on weekends, and they fixed up the maternal and paternal homes into their weekend places to rest and enjoy. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting what they've done with the village, because it has become a very pretty, enjoyable place, because there's very little work being done there except, a few tomato plants here and there and olive trees and that sort of thing.
Mm. Tell us the name of the village.
The name of the village is Carpinedo sulla Nora, because it's on the Nora River. Okay. And it's in the province of Pescara, which is on the Adriatic side of Italy, and it is basically central Italy, almost directly east of Rome.
Okay. And what region would that be?
That would be Abruzzi, is the
Abruzzi,
province.
okay.
I mean, the
region.
regione is province, is Cascada.
Yes.
Yeah, they refer to their states as regions, and then what we call counties, they call provinces.
Right, so the region is
And then what we call
Abruzzi.
counties, they call parishes.
Yeah. Oh,
La parrocchia di.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So your father, he learned the craft from his father?
From his father, who had learned it from his father. No, but my father was actually apprenticed out.
Oh.
And he had to serve a 3-year apprentice in order to be a master craftsman in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to live. It became almost like an indentured servant when you were an apprentice. You lived away from home, you lived with the master, and then after the 3 years you came back home and you were considered, a guild member kind of thing.
Where was he sent? Do you know?
Probably 20 miles away. I never got the name of the town.
Okay.
The only thing I ever heard was he did not enjoy the meals because they weren't like his mother's.
They never. Now, why would your father not have learned from his father?
It just wasn't done.
Wasn't
It wasn't done in terms of you wouldn't be recognized as a true craftsman if you learned from your father.
Okay.
Although my father did teach his brothers, but that's the way it was done, and it cost money. You had to pay for it.
Okay.
And it was a sort of a tuition, if you will. And that was done mainly for shoemakers, tailors, cabinet makers, bearing in mind that in those days you could not go out and buy finished furniture that easily, or even caskets for the dead. These people had the cabinet makers. My mother would tell me that they would have coffins half finished, and they would just finish them for the day of the funeral. Shoes had to be made. My father would actually go out to these large estates where they had tenant farmers and that sort of thing, and they would make shoes for everybody there. They would stay probably a week, and make 10 or 15 pairs of shoes and repair their saddles and all the leather work, and it was a whole kind of activity. And they would do that for 50, 60 miles around.
Wow.
Very interesting kind of, and they would go, they'd pack their tools, pack a mule, go off and get this work done, then come back.
So did they work on the leather itself?
Oh, yes. They didn't tan it, they bought tanned leather. But then they'd start from scratch. They made their own patterns, their own lasts, they did their own measurements. It was incredible. I mean, my father could look at a foot, and with a piece of tape, he'd make a last and make a shoe. But that's the way they were trained,
Right. Now, did he continue doing that when he came here?
When he
did
came,
it change much?
when he came here, the polio was a very prevalent problem, and he made a lot of shoes for polio victims, or modified a lot of shoes. And then he got into actual shoe repairing. In fact, much of that influence rubbed off on me, and I got interested in becoming a podiatrist because of that. And I could see him putting lifts on shoes. I made my first pair of shoes with my dad. I was about 9 or 10 years old, helping him out and learning how to do it. I sort of grew up with it. And my uncles worked with him, and then we had 3 shoe repair shops going at one time. My dad also wholesaled leather and heels and nails and stitching material for the shoes. He became a finder, so he was cover the whole gamut of the shoe thing.
Just so we could record this, tell me what the process was that you remember. For example, when someone wanted a pair of shoes, they would come and see your father,
Yes.
one of his brothers.
All right. Well, first thing they did was have them stand up on a piece of paper, and they would outline the foot. And My dad did this without half of the education that I had in terms of this. But he says, when you put the weight on the foot, that's the real size. And he would measure this out. Then he would measure the girth of the foot, just like the waist of a body, around the foot. And then he'd also measure around the ankle. And he got these measurements. And then if he had a ready-made last, he could use that. If he didn't, he'd have to make one or modify one, because he had certain basic ones that had been pre-made, because manufactured lasts began to come out. They were made in Lynn, Mass. In fact, Lynn was apparently the foundation of the shoe trade in the United States. And then he would modify that. Then he would proceed to make a pattern of the leather and the lining. Now this was done in a living room, if you called it that. But my father had this sewing machine, and this is where we would cut the patterns out and then assemble the upper of the shoe, and then he put it on the last. Now putting that on the last, you cut an insole to put on the bottom of the last, which would be the sole of the bottom of the foot. And then the leather was drawn over that. And then it was stitched, and a welt was put on, called a Goodyear welt, because that was an American process. And it was stitched by hand, and then to that was fastened the sole. And that was the intriguing part, because when you had a polio victim, one foot usually was, or one leg would be shorter than the other. Or sometimes you had to put a weight, because as a shriveled up limb, as a result of the polio, would not grow unless it was pulled on. So by adding weight to the shoe, as the youngsters would try to run, it would pull on that leg and encourage a little extra growth. And I remember weighing those things in half a pound or a pound or 3 pounds, whatever it was, to try to bring that leg to its fullest capacity, even though it had been affected by the polio. So there was a lot of, interesting little details involved with it. But that's basically it. And then, we put the eyelets on. We had a little machine to put eyelets and laces. And sometimes we had to cut laces and put a special tip on, because on some of these patients they had a higher type shoe, sort of a semi-boot, like a chukka boot effect, to hold it on a shriveled limb.
Were there different styles that people could choose from, or was it
Not
basically
as
just one?
not as it is today. Far from it.
Right.
Far from it. In fact, I remember the transitional period when shoes went from being nailed to being stitched, because they would use little tacks, the old tacking shoemaker. And when the machines came in, I think my dad was one of the first ones to have an electric stitching machine in New England. And other people that did shoes in the area would bring them to him. They'd do everything else but stitch them, and he would stitch them on the machine, and he got a fee for stitching the shoes for them.
Where did he buy that machine? Do you know?
He couldn't buy it.
Oh, he had to.
Couldn't buy it. You had to get it from the Goodyear the Goodyear stitching company, and there was a royalty. There was actually a stitch meter, and you paid by the stitch. They would come and read the meter. And in fact, this company, the Goodyear company, not Goodyear Stitching, not the rubber company, they actually were sued after World War II. It went that long before people were allowed to buy them, because it was considered a monopoly, and they were cracked. But the insidious part of it all, which was very unfair, following World War I, they started making these machines. They were on royalty in this country, but they were being sold overseas, so that the overseas shoemakers began to compete with ours in a very unfair way. Because the foreign laws did not protect the copyright, the patent laws that we have here. That was an interesting...
Must be. But so how was it that your father was given this?
Well, he read about it, and decided he needed one, and he was sort of a avant-garde kind of person anyway. And he got it. You know, he had to pay for it. He couldn't own it outright. You had to buy it, but then you had to pay the royalty on it. So it was a two-way hookup, you know.
Right. So was he? Did he do each step of the shoe, or did he do some of it and then hand it over to his brothers? Or
Well, they all did. They worked together.
they worked together?
Oh yeah, they worked independently and they worked together.
Okay.
You know, and sometimes it would be like a little mass production line on a small scale. One would do one would do the other, depending what they were doing that day. And of course, to run these machines, you had to heat them up. They were gas fired because rosin was in there, and the rosin had to be. You had to melt the rosin to a soft, because when the thread went through there to give it strength, it was dipped in and out of the rosin. So they didn't run that stitcher every day. They would run it like 3 times a week. So the other days would be in preparation for that. Much like the old tailors did when they had the steam presses. They would get all their work done and they would press on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I used to see that in the neighboring tailor shop. That was an interesting experience too. Oh, they collaborated and they helped each other in many different ways, you know. For instance, the tailors had a sewing machine. My father had a sewing machine. And if a belt would break, or somebody needed a piece, or if there was any way of getting together, it was a whole different ball game in those days. People got along and cooperated very nicely.
And where exactly was his shop?
Right on Water Street. Today it's 286 Water Street was the actual address. He started at 305, and he was there for about 5 years. And when he put his machine in, he had to lengthen the back end of the building in order to get the machine in. And after he went through the expense of doing that, the landlord raised his rent. So he decided he'd buy his own building, which he did. And he had adequate space there for almost the rest of his life, you know. In fact, my dad died the day my dad worked the day he died. He, 78 years of age, and he just, every day.
So that's where you get it.
You know, yeah, he cut down a little. He cut down a little bit, but and my uncle worked until he was 86, on and off. And then when we got rid of the shop, my uncle put a little bit of tool layout in his basement, and he continued to do work for the neighbors and friends. And
at that point, it was probably just repair work and not making a shoe.
That's right.
So how much did a pair of shoes cost?
Oh, I remember the highest price. I think the highest price my father ever got for a pair of shoes was probably $30. The highest price now. The highest price. More than likely, he probably got 15. That's when you could buy an exquisite pair of shoes, shop made, for about 5 to 7. Give you an idea of prices.
Wow. And how long did it usually take to make a pair?
Depending on, you know, how much modification was necessary, they could make a pair of shoes in a day, or it could take up to 3 or 4 days. But now, that would not be the only pair of shoes they'd be working on, though.
Right.
They'd be doing all the welt in one day, and maybe, you know, that sort of thing. But, no, well, you know, those were the days when people were working for $3 and $4 a week. I remember WPA days when people were getting $12 a week, $17 a week to support families. So that still was, you know, it sounds like a little, but it was a considerable amount of money in those days. I used to shine shoes, and shines were a nickel. And when I was 10 years old, I was making almost $20 a week between tips, and I would share with my father. I had a shoe shine stand with 6 chairs. And I kept busy Saturday nights and Sunday. Saturday nights were the big night. It wasn't Friday night in those days. And I would shine shoes. I'd start at noontime, work until maybe 10 o'clock. We'd close at 11, get up and open Sunday morning at 6 o'clock for the Mass. And then we had to close at noontime. It was against the law to be open beyond noontime. And like I said, I'd make anywhere $16, $18, $20 a week, which was a lot of money.
So where were these chairs set up?
On my father's shop.
Right at
Yeah,
the shop?
yeah. We had a
This
storefront.
Okay. And this was your
And
idea?
of course, right next to St. Bernard's Church, because people would come in and get their shoes shined and go to church, you know. And I had my regular customers, you know, who then some of them became my patients.
Really?
You know.
So it was your idea to start shining shoes, or did you?
No, my dad put the shoe shine stand in. In fact, a lot of the Italo-American youth worked for my dad shining shoes. You know, 6 months here, summer vacations, and a lot of them went through that place. He was known as the local philosopher, sort of like a Cracker Barrel place. You know, they'd come in and they'd chit chat. And I remember a fellow by the name of he's a pharmacist that got gassed in World War I. Tom Kirby. And he'd come in and he'd sit down and he'd spend the days there because he couldn't work anymore. And I'm sure between my father's interest in feet and shoes and Tom's interest in medicine, they got me interested. Because he'd say, you know, young fellow, you want to look into this thing. You could be a foot doctor someday. And he would explain different mixtures of medications and things he'd been through. And of course, he was living on a pension, and the poor guy couldn't do a day's work, and he'd have these terrible fits of coughing because he'd been gassed. He was one of those victims. But I think, you know, we didn't have television, but we had a lot of interesting people around us in those days. They would talk to us, and they had time for kids. And I enjoyed it, and there were a couple of other people who were there that had been in the service, and I could hear their, not necessarily war stories, but their stories about living in the barracks and being with the other men and what they did and where they traveled, and that was our entertainment.
So maybe that gave you the stimulus to get an education?
Oh,
and see
yes.
the world?
Oh, yeah. There was never a question whether or not we were going to go to college. It's which one and what we're going to take up.
So all of you?
All of us. My father was, you know, in those days, I remember people coming and saying, Joe, what are you sending your girls to college for? And he said, it's okay, because they're my daughters. I want them to go to school. And then when they would come in with their problems, you know, either it was a problem with their tax bill or their water bill, and one of my sisters was there with me. And they spoke Italian, they spoke English, you know. And they'd say, see, that's why I sent them to school. Because they would come in the shop, you know, we all helped out. We'd do our homework there.
Okay.
But we also were there in case someone came in and Dad was busy on the machine, couldn't be interrupted running those things. You know, we learned to be part of the community.
And Dominic and Rocco were in the same shop?
Dominic had his own shop later.
He
He opened his own, and Rocco was there. So it was my father and Rocco and myself, my sister Rosario, who now lives in Connecticut. And, you know, we were the consultants, the unofficial consultants in the neighborhood sometimes.
Really?
Yeah. And I think that's when my sister got her yearning to be a teacher. You know, because she was always teaching somebody how to do this or how to do that, and she was a natural at it, both of them.
So getting back to the shoe shining, it may seem simple now, but it's sort of a lost art. So describe it a little bit. Where did you get the polish and
well,
the
some
rags?
of the polish we bought in 5-gallon containers, and of course then we would pour out in quantities. We'd also sell it to other shoemakers. Or sometimes we made our own. We could buy the powder and add water to it. And I think it was the first time when concentrates were beginning to come out. And basically you had a little liquid with a dauber brush, and you kind of wash off the shoe with either the black polish or the brown polish. In those days, everything was black and brown, except in the summertime, when they had Spectator whites and brown. And we liked those because that was a 25-cent shine. Because we had to do the white polish and the brown, or the white and the black, like a Spectator. But you'd put the polish on, rub it off, and that was sort of a washing liquid. Then you would apply the wax paste, and brush it off. And we did that twice, and then you rub it off with a cloth, and you got your shine. But it was all work. It wasn't, you didn't just put it on and wait for it to dry.
I see.
You had to work it in.
Work it
Almost
in.
like Simonizing an automobile, the
Okay.
same concept.
So who cleaned the rags?
My mother would wash them, or we would soak them, first and get most of it out and then run them through a wash. And sometimes by hand.
I don't
Okay.
think that would be a very fun job. Huh?
We had public laundries in those days. We didn't have do-it-yourself, but laundries would come, and they would pick up your clothes and bring them back wet washed. Then you'd hang them out to dry and iron them, that sort of thing. But they also had, for mechanics and shoemakers and garages, they sort of had a dirty wash kind of thing, for shoe shine cloths, and they would take those in, wash them and bring them back, and then you'd hang them out to dry.
I see.
So it's...
Now, you had mentioned a few days ago that I believe it was one of your teachers, maybe, who would say, Joe, now you don't want to do this for the rest of your life.
Well,
You want to use that
that
mind
was
of
Miss
yours.
Courtney. She was one of my good customers, but she was also an unofficial teacher for my dad in English, and she'd correct him when he made a mistake in the pronunciation, and he had a lot of respect for her. And she'd come in, I would shine her shoes, and she'd say, now that's a nice job, but you don't want to do this the rest of your life. And I remember my father had a dried up lemon, which was a container for snuff. And he never used snuff. I don't know why he had it there. I think some of his customers had brought it in because from the old country that's what they used to do. They'd dry a lemon or an orange. They would hollow it out, put a little cork in it, and they would put their snuff in it. And that's how they carried it. And she'd say, see that lemon? That's a dried up lemon. That's what happens when you don't use it. That's what's going to happen to your brain. It's going to dry out. And I never forgot that. and my father would pick up on it. He'd say, remember what she said now. It's going to dry up like that lemon. In fact, when I went to Italy, I picked up a couple of oranges from my uncle's monastery, and I dried them out, and I have them as little dried out oranges.
Wow. So what do you do? Just cut the top and
You just let it hang,
Oh, let
and
it
they
hang.
dry.
Okay.
And then they become like a gourd, like a miniature gourd.
I see.
But funny things you remember.
So you used to do your homework right at the shop.
Frequently, because then in 1938, 39, we moved from, we lived in a cottage behind the shop. And my dad decided we had to live in the country because his first love was also a garden. So he bought a house up on Merriam Avenue, which is across from Kmart. And that was before Kmart was built and before Route 2 was even finished.
Is that house still standing?
The house is still standing, and it's now Danino's electronic repair as you go by there.
Okay.
It's got a red barn, and we raised lots of tomatoes. My father had 600 plants of tomatoes. We had 8 acres of land. That really turned me off. I used to do all the weeding, a lot of the weeding, but my father and my 2 uncles really enjoyed that land. I mean, we had 600 plants of tomatoes, and we had we had about 8 acres. We had about an acre of potato and corn, and we had so much that my father went out and got a couple of young hogs to use up the surplus, and then I learned how to make Italian sausage. My father left Italy when he was just about 20. So some of these things he really didn't learn, but my mother did. So it was interesting to watch my father telling my father how to do these things because, it's not the reverse role in the Italian-American family.
So your mother
But
telling you.
my mother was a pretty bright lady in terms of how we're going to make the sausage and how we're going to flavor it. And they would get some of their Italian friends together, and they would all sort of pitch in, and we'd make the salami, we would make the sausage, we'd make the prosciutto, and my mother taught them how to make cheese. We got to know some of the farmers, and we got some fresh milk, and my mother would make cheese. So many of the Italian things we really, we recreated here.
Okay.
And many of them did, you know.
And
Was
he
it-
had time to do this?
Oh, he
and-
loved that.
and
Every
work?
weekend, every
Oh,
weekend,
weekend
every
work.
night. That was, my father's love was the country. He just loved being outdoors. And I think that's what kept him living so healthy for so long. He was 78 years old. Like I said, he worked the day he died. He had a heart attack and never knew it, apparently. He never felt any pain.
Oh.
You know, and then he kind of dropped and we picked him up, brought him to the hospital. He said, I don't know what's the matter. And next morning he was dead. So it was interesting to see how he lived that way. But he did like, and then, of course, you know, my mother would can all those tomatoes, and we would also, I remember going out, which was not uncommon in those days, you'd go out to a farm and you would buy a peach tree. But you bought the peaches on the tree, and we would pick the peaches, bring them home. My mother would make peach jam, peach jelly, can the peaches, and we all got involved, you know. It was sort of a community thing. And making polander was an interesting thing. You know, if you've ever had polander, it's made with coarse cornmeal. And they would make it on a board, the same board that was used to make your pasta on. My mother would make it, spread that out, and you'd sit and you'd eat from your end of the table, not with a dish. And you'd have a topping on it, almost like a pizza. You know, tomato, meatball, ground hamburger, rather, ground meat, or cheese,
So
depending
everyone
on.
just sit
And you
eat
take
up to
you
the
take your
middle,
section, yeah, and then what was left in the middle, the next day would be fried. It'd be solidified, you know. It was quite good actually. But
So they used to make their own sausage too.
oh yeah, we made sausage. We made our own prosciutto. We made our own salami. The interesting thing about making the sausage was we had it fresh when we made it, and then you always made more than you could use. They would cut the sausage up into links, put it in a jar, like a canning jar, and you would render the fat from the hog, and you'd pour the hot fat in, and that would preserve it. And it was just like canning. And in the middle of the winter, when you really wanted a good sausage kind of sauce, you would scoop some of those out, put in the sauce, and it was delicious.
Sounds good. Now, was
And then
Dominic,
we would dry some of it too, like a pepperoni would come out, you know, cured.
now was Dominic living with your family at this time?
Oh yeah, Dominic lived with us until, oh my God, I went in the service. Of course, my other uncle too, and then after the war, we had an 8-room house, 4 bedrooms, so it worked out well. And of course, my sisters had gone off teaching, so it was kind of nice because my father had his company, and my mother got along very well with her brothers-in-law. They were very good to her. Hard worker, but my mother didn't know how to cook for 2 or 3 people.
Oh, no Italian
of
woman
course,
does.
of course, it wasn't just a family of 7. You know, it was really, we all brought our friends home. So my mother cooked. It was usually for 10, 12, you know, that sort of thing.
So
That's
now,
fun.
when you were living in the country, so to speak,
Yeah.
how did your dad get to work? Or did he?
Oh, my father was always a car owner from way back. They weren't new cars, but he always had either a 7-passenger Packard or a 7-passenger Lincoln that he'd probably buy that was 4 or 5 years old and had jump seats in the middle. So it was that forerunner to the station wagons in a sense.
Okay.
And we drove we all drove when we were 16.
Did he work on Saturdays also?
Oh yeah, and
So-
Sunday mornings.
And he
But,
still had time to
Oh
garden?
yeah.
and-
Well, later on in life, he cut that out.
Okay.
You know, or they would take turns on Sunday morning going in and that sort of thing. But no,
What time would he get there in the morning?
drive?
No, what time would he get to the shop?
Oh, they would get there at 7:30, 8 o'clock. They would none of this 9 o'clock stuff. You know,
Now,
and they worked. They didn't work. They didn't quit at 6. In fact, when the NRA was passed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's programs. You probably read about it in history. We lived through it. The National Recovery Act. They had this eagle with the little, and everybody was supposed to close at 6 o'clock. It was a law. It was declared unconstitutional later on. But the idea of that was to spread the work around, so everybody, had a chance to get a job. And I remember closing the front door, but we worked in the back room. But we couldn't be open for business.
Now, did he go home for lunch?
Oh yeah. Well, we lived in the cottage behind the shop.
And that
But
cottage
then
is
when we
no
mo-
longer there,
Yeah.
right?
No, they tore it down.
Right.
Now, when we moved away from there, my mother would pack a lunch.
Okay.
And I mean a lunch.
Yeah.
Like scrambled eggs and peppers and Italian bread, or he had a pot-bellied stove, and we put our sausage in there and cooked them on a spit. Made our own coffee. We get along pretty well.
So I want to go back to your childhood, but I'm thinking that right now, maybe we should talk about how did your practice compare with your father's shop, as far as people coming in? And
It was interesting because I started in practice 1954. Got out of school in 53, came home, got ready, got the place going, and many of my patients would just relate the fact that he grew up with shoes and feet, so he must be pretty good at it. And customarily, foot problems would go either into the drugstore and buy some corn plasters or something they thought would help. They go to the shoe store and buy a new shoe, or they go to the shoemaker and get the shoe stretched. So my father and my uncle in their shops were the source of a lot of referrals for me. And of course, there again, fortunately, our family was fairly well known. We got names in the paper for the honor roll and that sort of thing, and people knew us, and the name was known, and people associated feet with Addante. It's just one of those things, which to me was a tremendous advantage. Not only that, but the shoe stores in town, when they got an imperfect shoe and something had to be modified, or some customer wasn't happy because an eyelet was broken, my dad would service those shoe stores. So they got to know me, and I would deliver the shoes, and when someone went in there with a bad foot, they'd say, "Why don't you go see Joe Addante?" So that, to me, it was a major asset.
so there was never a question of you setting up shop in another town?
Oh, no, I never gave it a thought. Well, let me put it this way. I got tempted, okay? I was married when I was in school.
You married when you were in school?
Yeah, I got married in my second year, the end of my second year. And I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I figured, I'm going to do this, I'll succeed, so I think I can take a chance and get married. And my wife and I had known each other for 7 years by that time, because we had an interruption with the war and everything else. So when I was getting through school, my dean called me in and he said, "I want you to go to York, Pennsylvania. One of my classmates has a brain tumor, and I want you to take his practice." Because I used to give a course in shoe therapy as a student. I used to help them out because I grew up with it, And he got to like me. And his wife was Alice, and he got married on Thanksgiving. And my wife was Alice. I got married on Thanksgiving.
Wow.
So we kind of, he's still alive. He's 99 years old.
Wow.
And he's still with it. I give him a call about once a month. Delightful guy, Dean Cross. So I went out to York. We drove out. My wife and I drove out. We had a tiny little car that I bought for $50. It looked like a VW. It was a Willys. They call
And
it.
what year is this about?
Oh, 1953. The early part of 53.
Okay.
I think it was February, May. And the practice had just been sold to someone else. And but the man that had it took us around town, showed us, very, very nice. But I felt honored that he would consider me, to take care of his classmates' practice. And then there was another man in Philadelphia that asked me to work with him for a few weeks, which I did. And I said, nah. Then I found out my wife was pregnant. And I said, "Hey, we're going home." I never knew my grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And I want my kids to know their grandparents. And fortunately they did. They got to know both grandparents, both sides, which I thought was a very important thing. And I'm very comfortable in my community. I love to travel,
Mm-hmm.
which I have quite a bit, but this is base. And Fitchburg, even when we lived on Miriam Avenue in Leominster, I always used my father's store address. I just had to think about Fitchburg.
Okay. See, that's one thing I didn't realize is Miriam Ave is in Leominster.
Yeah,
So you
it's
moved
right over the
from-
line.
I see.
So when I was about 15, 14, 15, we moved there. But I would never use that address. All my correspondence was always directed to my father's shop.
Isn't that funny?
There was a sense of loyalty there.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit about you growing up. Last week you said, you made a comment that stuck with me. You knew who was making bread which day, and you could go in to
Oh.
neighbor's house, and it was just wonderful.
When I reflect on that,
Mm-hmm.
I realize now how lucky we were.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't rich, but we were very, very fortunate. No one had a key to the house. Doors were open all the time. And you knew that Mrs. Lynetta made bread maybe on Tuesday, and Mrs. Chicala did it on Wednesday, and you were welcome to walk in, and they'd give you a piece of hot bread, butter, olive oil. If anybody got sick, if any mother got sick, the other mothers jumped right in. There was no question about who was going to babysit, because nobody could do anything. They all had 5 or 6 kids. My family, I was lucky that we had a smaller family, because my mom and dad had that 10-year gap. But most of those families had 5 children, 6 children, 7 children. Not unusual at all. And they're all great cooks, and look, they made salads with dandelion, which are delicious if you get to like it. They used every bit of a chicken, if they had the head, the neck, and the feet, they made soup. And by the time they got the soup and the homemade pasta in that soup, man, it was great. And that's the way we grew up. There was no, how can I put it, nobody coming in and being a babysitter and who you're going to pay for this. It just took care of itself. And the other thing that was unknown, the Blue Cross Blue Shield didn't exist. You either belonged to the Sons of Italy or the Elks or the Eagles, and then when you needed a doctor, you got them for 50 cents. And that was a community endeavor. Or the visiting nurse would come by, going to the dentist was a 50-cent excursion to the city dentist. These are some of the things that we all kind of grew up with.
So you really grew up in an Italian neighborhood. Everyone was Italian? Or?
Not everyone, no. We had a Polish family across the street. We had a number of Irish. There were 2 Irish ladies across the way where I would stay and visit with them, and I'd run errands for them, and they'd make me a cookie. And Thanksgiving in Islo America, let me give you a disaster area in a sense, but it really wasn't. My mother learned how to make piccalilli, and she learned how to make apple pie, mincemeat pie from the Gilmartins and Mrs. O'Neill, all right, across the street. My mother would teach them about pasta. Now, when Thanksgiving came along, you had to have the Italian, the chicken meatball soup and the pasta and all that. And then the American turkey came out with the mincemeat pie and the pumpkin pie. And we just, when you thought you were finished, you were just beginning, because we had to be American.
Okay.
But we still had to have the old country. Okay? So there was a whole lot of integration that took place in those years. And it was nothing compared to what there is today in terms of resistance and, diversity just existed. It was an evolution. But then again, everybody was from someplace. And they had freshly remembered their own prejudices, if you will. The Irish came over here earlier than the others, but they had to meet a lot of resistance. And then the Italians came in, and the Poles came in. And it was a whole, It was a gradual, then the intermarriages began to take place, you know. And of course we had the same religion, which I think made a difference.
Okay.
You know, you didn't have this competitive potential for animosity.
But you mentioned the Latin invasion at one point.
Yeah. Well, I
Was
think
that
some people, you know, you're always going to get some that resist change, and I think it's more fear than it is. You know, people are afraid of what they don't understand and they don't know, and once they get to know you, it's a different story. And I think we're going through the same thing today ourselves with a lot of the diversity programs that are coming in. I think that's the benefit of it. I don't think there was any resentment in those days because people worked very hard for what they got. There's very, very little welfare. I mean, welfare didn't come in until the late 30s. You know.
That's a good point. Little resentment because everyone's working. And
Everybody was
feels
working.
like they're getting away with something.
Everybody was working, and you helped one another. You know, if the door was broken and you had to hang the door, then they would come and say, "Can I hold that for you while I put that screw in? Or can I help you paint your house?" And it was mutual, you know. And my father would raise his tomatoes, and somebody would have an apple tree. We'd swap. It's different today.
Were things different after you moved to Merriam Avenue?
They got better.
They got better?
Things always get better because, you know, we're talking about a different era, a bigger house. Depression was over, you know. Although, frankly, we never really felt the pinch of depression like many other people did. Because what happened during depression, as far as my father was concerned, people could not buy new shoes, but they would want to have their shoes repaired. They had to have them repaired. And a shoe repairman, to distinct from a shoemaker, did very well during the lean years because people got their shoes repaired. And actually, it wasn't really, we didn't feel a whole lot of that pinch. Things were slower, you know, and those were the days people charged things, a lot of money on the books. And, you know, you had notebook and you write Mrs. Jones and so much, and another page, you know, we didn't have computers.
I hear a little ticking noise. But so we were talking about your father's books, and sometimes charges were forgiven because some people couldn't make a payment.
Oh, yeah. That was common with the shoemaker. It was common with the tailor. It was common with, especially the grocery stores. I mean, those people were the welfare departments in those days. And I'd venture to say that 30% was written off on their books. In many, many cases, they were the people that kept people eating. You know, whether it was Zarella on Water Street and Fiandaca and Pandisho up in Clegon. I understand Mr. Sala did the same thing when he was up there. They were great people. They were great people. They were compassionate people, you know, but they knew their customers. They knew who was working and who wasn't working and who could afford to pay and who really couldn't afford to pay. And there was a lot of the human element in it, because neighborhoods were neighborhoods. You know, like, you know, the policeman on the beat. He walked the beat. He was a friend. And you got to know him, you know. It wasn't just a stranger just driving through on a cruiser. I think that was important too, because you had an example. I recall somebody bringing a gambling machine into my father's store. And he said, "You know, Mr. Addante, all you got to do is leave this machine here, and we can give you $50 a week," which is a lot of money in those days. It was a nickel machine. So, not knowing what this thing was all about, my father said, "Okay, leave it." Well, the policeman came in the next day. He says, "Joe, do you know what you have there?" And he says, "No." He says, "It's a game. You put your money." He said, "Well, it's not legal, you know." And he said, "Well, look, I'll take it out." He says, No, I don't want you to take it out yet." He says, "We want to get this guy who's going around corrupting people. So you just let us know the days he's coming." And they came quietly, and they finally put this fellow away. but they would come in and advise. They weren't ready to, you know, they knew how to work with the community. I remember there was a series of breaks and entries that were taking place, and also there was a certain amount of bootlegging. That my father tells me this story because by the time I grew up, came along, they had repealed prohibition, and the police would get on top of my father's building with little binoculars or a spyglass, and they could see what was going on and who was bootlegging, and there were some people that were, and but there was a cooperative element, but if a kid got in trouble, the interesting thing in those days was the policeman would grab you by the nape of the neck, maybe boot you in the pants, and take you home to your father. Okay? And your father would straighten you out. You didn't get written up. You didn't have to go on probation. You didn't have to go to court. There was no suing for police brutality. And the kids got straightened out. And you ended up becoming friends in the end. You weren't that, different scene today.
What happened, do you think?
Well, I think that the rights come in, maybe I'm sure there must have been some abuses, which gives justification for some of these things, but I wonder. And there's a different element. There isn't I don't think the sincerity is there. I don't think we can afford to have that kind of a subjective decision made on that level. People don't trust anybody anymore, so you have to go to court, you have to get your lawyer, and you have to, it seems that some things that were so simple when we grew up, and they probably were simpler because there weren't as many people, there weren't as many temptations, there weren't as many opportunities to do wrong. We're on.
Okay. Someone my age, we hear from our parents and our grandparents and now you, just how life seemed more simple and people seemed happier and people seemed more willing to open their door and help, let's say, every child in the village and not just your own. When do you think this competitive edge came about and people no longer helping their neighbor? Do you remember a shift in attitudes living here?
Well, my own impression, and that's one person's impression, but when we were growing up, we were happy to have those things for survival. In other words, a roof over our heads, good meal, chance to go to school, a chance to advance, keeping the family together was very important. Mother was home. Most cases, mother was home. There were very few women who, maybe a nurse or a teacher, and they were not married most of the time. The nurses were probably. I think that had an effect on the family too. Now, take away from that and get into World War II. We fought the last great war, if you will. Everybody was dedicated. Everybody wanted to do it. And then we came out, and we were going to give our kids those things that we never had, which was probably a major mistake. I think there's an attitude today of entitlement on the part of young folks. They think they're entitled to all of these things without realizing that somebody has worked very hard. Also, we introduced welfare programs, which we never had before. So instead of depending on one another in neighborhoods where you had a conscience and you had to take care of the poor guy next door if you had a problem, you figure, well, the state's going to do it, so why should you care? You got welfare, you got Medicaid, you got so many things that people just have a right to in their attitude. And you wonder if they really do have a right to all of these things in many ways without working for it. In those days, you didn't dare be a gold brick, so to speak. I mean, if you were working, you worked. If you could possibly work, you worked. Because if you didn't, your neighbors wouldn't help you because they would know that. They knew who the person was that was goofing off, and we had a few. Every generation has them. but it was less prevalent than it is today. And I think the resentment on the part of working people is when you see somebody going on welfare that probably doesn't have to go on welfare. I don't think it's as bad as people think, but it's so offensive when it happens. It gets magnified, and then we go against these programs. And I think these programs are really designed for people who really need help, and I think it's wonderful that we have them. And I don't think we do enough to discourage the people who abuse it. Does that change? Yeah, and I think what happens, it hardens people. Say, gee whiz, I work awfully hard and this guy doesn't, or this woman doesn't. Why should they have this? And then the other thing is, I think the moral standards, marriage doesn't mean what it used to. 40% of the kids in school today come from single-parent families. And even if they don't come from a single-parent family, they come from a family where both parents are working. And I think, we all want so much so soon. Some of it's necessary, and some of it may be just because we want so much. And I think children react to the fact that mother's not always home. And there's nothing like a mother's influence on a child. I think when we come home for lunch, we came home for lunch from school, and mother was there with a hot lunch. Mother was there. And then we had supper at home, and mother was there. Okay? We were raised by our mothers more than our fathers, because our fathers were working. They weren't working 8-hour days. They were working 10, 12-hour days. And frequently in those areas, we had child labor laws, but there was nothing against a child helping out. And there was nothing against spanking a child. Today, you can't spank a child in public. You're going to be cited for abuse, which is kind of ridiculous in a sense. I think, there are abuse cases, but that's my impression.
Tell me about your mother's influence on you, and what did you call her?
Mom, mom, mama. Great influence. My mother was a hovering mother. She was a great lady. She was my interceptor, if you will. She was my buffer between my dad and myself. She was a buffer, especially between my dad and my sisters, because my father was very hard on the girls. Italian fathers always, protected their daughters. And lipstick was not allowed, and curling their hair, and we weren't allowed to go to the movies until we were 14 or 15 years old, because that was all artificial. He would take us out of school to take us to the circus. That was real. He would actually come to the school, and I remember the Mother Superior saying, Mr. Dunn, oh no, I know, but it's circus, meaning it's almost like going to church. They got to see these are real people performing, not that stuff on the screen.
Where would you go? Where would the circus be around?
He would take me to Boston, Worcester, Fitchburg had a circus. He would come. We'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and watch the circus train come in. Watch the elephants unload the train. That was my father's biggest treat. He just loved the circus, and he had a lot of respect for it, because these are people who they actually do it. You can see them doing it. It's not just a facade. And that was a great thing with him. But to this day, I laugh when I think about the Mother Superior saying, you can't take them out of school. I know, but I could take them to the circus.
It's okay. So you had 2 sisters?
My sister Mary was the oldest. She's passed away. She was sort of the first, she broke the ice for the American way, and I'm sure she had to meet my father's resistance, because although my father spoke English fairly well and wanted to be integrated, Ben, he had 10 years and all this stuff, but he still had old country ideas about daughters and what children should be, and we were beginning to, liberalize a little different from the old country. And I'm sure she met the resistance that we benefited from, because she broke down some of the barriers. And my sisters were very good to me. basically I had three mothers. My mother and my two sisters, they always took care of me. They spoiled me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I never went without a shirt being done or a tie being done, and you know, it just they were great, and they were good students.
Mm-hmm.
They were truly good scholars. They were both speakers in their class, and they graduated. One was salutatorian, one was third highest in her class. And
So how much older were they than you?
My sister Mary was 4 years older than me, and my sister Rosaria was 3 years older than me.
Okay.
So they set a good pace for me.
Mm-hmm. So was there a big party when you were born?
Oh, big party. From what they tell me. From what they tell me.
Right.
And, you know, the son has finally arrived after having lost one. You know, I think there was a double benefit there. I remember my father telling me he opened a barrel of wine, and even Mary Botley got a little bit tipsy when they baptized me, and they had a big party, and so that was a neighborhood thing. You know, the son finally came back. You know, well, they finally had a son. I guess that meant a lot, but you know, it was a whole shindig, and they talked about it for a long time.
But as far as education-wise, you weren't treated any differently than your sisters?
No.
You were all expected to go on?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. My father was very much into education. In fact, one of my sisters was going to go to Stevens Business College because it was handy and it wasn't terribly expensive. They had it upstairs over Brooks' drugstore. And my father says, no. You can't do anything else. Go to State Teachers College. I want you to get an education. You can always do better after that, which is true. They did, you know, and they both got their masters. They both had good jobs and in teaching. They were respected, you know. So I guess he was right.
Now, the brother that you never knew, he was born right after their marriage in Italy, or do you know?
Shortly, yeah. In fact, I think he was a year older when my father left, and he died when he was about 3 or 4 years age. My father never saw him again.
So did you ever feel any pressure being the only son and doing right?
I think, you know, boys are not as academically, you know, if I got a B, if I didn't get an A, it didn't bother me, but it bothered my father. And he let me know about it. You got a boy, you know. He expected a little bit more of me. After all, I was his namesake, and that I think that exists even today.
I was going to ask you, how does that compare with your own children?
I don't think I made that distinction. And my daughter was always a little more conscientious, and you know, but my middle one, but the youngest one was too. So he's the one that graduated with honors and everything. So I never put that much pressure on, because I used to get this. Well, you know, you remember your sisters now. Remember your sisters. In fact, I separated my kids from school on account of that. You know, my daughter's going to Holy Family, my boys were there, and I started getting feelings about, you're not doing like your sister. So I put the boys in Applewell. Because I didn't want that to happen. I don't think it's fair. Personal. It didn't hurt me that much, but, you know, I just didn't like it.
You didn't like
I think everybody has the right to be their own person.
Right. So now your wife, do you think that she has any qualities that your mother had? Does that attract you? Yeah.
All of them. In many, many ways. You know, peacemaker, good mother, loyal wife, encouraging, not domineering. Yeah, you got an opinion, but never got in the way of doing what you had to do. Think twice, maybe, but, you know, don't you dare do none of that, you know. But no, I think it's there. I think those qualities were. I think they were when you came out of a family that was a family. That's where you're going to find it. And my mother-in-law was a great person. I mean, I have very good memories of my mother-in-law. And I say that with all sincerity, that I was gifted. And the women in my life, my mother, my mother-in-law, my wife, my daughter, my sisters, I think that makes a difference growing up.
So your wife, she was from Fitchburg.
Yes.
And you knew her for many years? Or you said 7 years before.
7 years. Well, I knew her, but I never got to meet her. And I was introduced to her by a friend of mine who I'm going to have dinner with today. His name was Bill Toms. This is interesting because I went to St. Bernard High, and one of my close friends left St. Bernard High School in the sophomore year and went to Fitchburg High for his third year because we didn't have dances and that sort of thing at the high school at the time. And he introduced me to this Bill Toms. And we went out in groups, but I went with a Catholic girl, and he would go to Protestant girl, and the Jewish guy with a Jew. We were diversified, but we were together. And I remember going in the service. He went in the service, and I was waiting to be called in. And it was Thanksgiving. And I met him at the supermarket because he was doing something for his mother on furlough, and I was doing something. He said, "You're going to the dance tomorrow night, Fitchburg High, and want us to play football, Thanksgiving. And then they have a dance at the end." I said, "I don't have a date." He said, "I know a girl." He says, "She's just got out of the hospital. She had a cut finger or something." He said, "I don't think she has a date. She's a nice Italian girl, Catholic," he says to me. It was really funny. It's the way we used to talk, And I said, "Oh, why not?" So I called her, and I took her to the Thanksgiving dance. And we met. And I knew the family because it was an Italian family.
What is the last name?
Baldarelli.
Baldarelli.
But her mother was not Italian, her father was. And we went to the Thanksgiving dance, and then we dated again, and then I went in the service. I used to write to her, back and forth and back and forth. But then we got married on Thanksgiving. So.
That's exciting.
And this Thanksgiving is going to be our 50th anniversary.
Really?
Yeah. So actually,
Is there a party planned,
50s. I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
But
was
no.
it expected that you would marry a Catholic and an Italian, or?
I think it was expected that I would marry a Catholic. Maybe my own expectation, having done parochial school all the way, and I even went to Holy Cross for part of the time before I went in the service. And my religion is close to me, but that's Italian. I think it made things a little bit easier. But my father-in-law was not, he hardly spoke or holy. He tried to sponge out exclude the Italian part. He wanted to be American. And that was not untrue with a lot of them that just wanted to be American. Now, my father wanted the English. He wanted to be American. He wanted the advantages, but he's very proud of his Italian heritage. And I think the literature got, he knew all the writings, and he would recite things. He knew the librettos of the operas, and so he had a different bent on things, And then I think my dad wanted to be a priest at one time, and he entered the monastery, and they found out how old he was, and they said, "You're too old, you're going to have to leave." And then his kid brother finally got to go, because he met my mother, and that changed that. But it's interesting the way these things evolve. But so I think because of that, and in the literature and the reading, we had this influence at home. And some of the other families didn't. They came from laboring families, and they wanted to be American, and They didn't see that other side of it.
And perhaps they felt discriminated in some way, because they may have been coming from a different region.
Yeah,
and
I think I'm not altogether sure, but I don't think my wife's grandparents were literate. So that could make a difference. And her father went to Nolan School at a time when he saw that he felt that they were squeezed and they weren't really well accepted. So he left the patch and he moved to Clegon. You know.
That was the French section,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It had a small Italian community at the time, but it was mainly French.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up going to St. Joseph's Parish, which was a French parish.
Oh.
So.
But you never felt that, you and your family?
No, in fact, I have never felt the prejudice people speak about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've always been,
Mm-hmm.
and proud of it, and maybe I've surrounded myself with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe there's things that I don't hear, but, I had patients come to me and they'd say, "You're Italian. I went to finishing school in Florence."
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff came through.
Okay.
But that's another, once in a while you have comments, but, I'm not happy with The Sopranos. I'm not happy with the mafia image. That bothers me. I think there's a little bit too much of that.
Why do you think people are embracing that image?
Because it's fun. For many people, we have glamorized a lot of those. The Godfather did it.
Mm-hmm.
Puzo got rich on it.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was a good movie. And they put the best talents into it because there's intrigue,
Mm-hmm.
Who knows who's going to take that over?
I mean another ethnic
Yeah,
group?
there'll be another ethnic group. Whether it's going to be the Latino drug dealer or something that's going to come into it. But maybe but that was frozen in time,
Mm-hmm.
I still think that the Italian image is the 1920 image, the mandolins, and that doesn't exist in Italy today. My greatest surprise is seeing the way Italy is and coming back here, and I go that frequently, to see the image that most people in this country think of, what's an Italian restaurant. Even the foods are different.
So it's almost frozen in time here.
Yeah, I think that we've done that because most of the people that came here wanted to be American, a lot of them. And the kids grew up American, but with the Italian foods that were prevalent in those days. And the image of the Italian in this country basically is Neapolitan Sicilian. It's not northern Italy, and it's not eastern Italy. It's not the Milanese. It's not the design. It's not the Gucci and the Armani.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what's in existence in Italy today.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't the fat mama in the black dress, like you saw in Zorba the Greek or any of that stuff. It doesn't exist anymore. They're the most, chic, well-dressed, and, fashion conscious like anybody else in the world, maybe more so.
Mm-hmm.
But that image is there. It's hard to change an image.
Mm. So you really haven't seen many bocce courts in Italy?
I haven't seen a bocce court in Italy. And I've been going, I've lost count how many times I've been to Italy. I haven't seen a bocce court.
Did your dad play bocce?
No.
No?
Once in a while I did, but rarely. He was not a big bocce fan. But bocce was a big thing in that time for those people who liked it.
Mm-hmm.
He knew about it, but he wasn't, but they had a bocce court at the Marconi Club. I remember when that went up. That was a big thing. They had a bocce court. But like I said, I haven't seen it in Italy. And I'm sure it's there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the villages. But even in my father's village, I haven't seen it. See, the interesting thing about that is the bocce courts have to be someplace where it's flat.
Right.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
My father's was a hill town. And most of theirs, the Apennines are all hill towns.
Mm-hmm.
You take the whole back of eastern Italy is the length of the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different... but that, to this day, I'm amused by some of the images of what the Italian is, and I say what it isn't. It's a different world.
Different world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder sometimes if it was that way then, if it just wasn't that way in a couple of spots where these were the immigrants that came over. Because most of the immigrants that came over here were from Sicily in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and they were from Naples. And then the others began to come, because that's where they needed to work.
Mm-hmm.
See, northern Italy was always industrial.
Right.
They were never out of work.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that accounts for it.
Mm. So I think that we should end here.
Okay.
So this is the end of interview number 1 with Joe Addante, but we do have an interview coming up next Monday, and then we will discuss the parish, social clubs, and your schooling.